March 24th, 1989. Just after midnight, a 987-foot tanker tore itself open along an ice-choked reef on the edge of Prince William Sound. 11 million gallons of crude hit water, locked beneath winter ice. The oil didn't drift. It slid under the surface and stayed there, trapped as the blackness spread out of sight. And that invisible spread demanded a cleanup. That killed more life than the oil. The Exxon Valdez didn't hit the reef in a storm. It hit on a night so calm the ocean sounded like static. Minutes before the crash, the tanker made a wide detour to avoid drifting ice. When the ship straightened out, the captain stepped off the bridge to rest, leaving a fatigued third mate alone to execute the final turn back into the shipping lane. It was a simple correction, but the turn never happened. The Valdez drifted off course, sliding toward a line of submerged reefs. No one was watching. And for nearly 20 minutes, the crew tried to feel their way through the darkness, believing the ship was exactly where the radar said it was, unaware that a blind spot had swallowed the only warning they needed. If you were the helmsman, final turn approaching, the captain asleep, would you follow the order as written, or wake him first? The answer matters more than it seems, because at 12:04 a.m., the ship slammed into the reef with 6 violent jolts. Not an explosion, more like a grinding, metallic heartbeat that ran the entire length of the hull. 8 cargo tanks ruptured in seconds, and in the dark, cold silence that followed, crude oil didn't gush upward. It pulsed outward like a black lung filling under pressure. The water was so cold it thickened the oil instantly, boosting its viscosity and keeping it just beneath the surface, an invisible sheet spreading sideways while the calm sea hid everything from sight. For 20 minutes they tried rocking the ship free. No alarms, no flooding. And when they finally radioed vessel traffic service, the message was painfully understated. We've had a grounding, possible damage. And somewhere in the Coast Guard logs from that night, one transmission would later disappear, one naming the breach severity minutes earlier. And something in that specific crude, its chemistry, would make this spill harder to clean than any before it. Alaska's winter didn't just slow the spill, it protected it. The months-old ice sheets floating across Prince William Sound turned the water into a hidden underworld where no skimmer, helicopter, or response team could reach. Oil didn't drift on the surface the way everyone expected. It slipped beneath the frozen ceilings, moving in slow, silent loops through a world no one could see. Earlier I mentioned something in this oil made it different. Here's why. It carried higher wax content and heavier fractions that weathered slowly. Instead of breaking apart, it thickened. It clung. Beneath the ice, it stuck to every ridge and pocket, blackening the undersides of the sheets like someone had dragged a brush of warm tar across frozen glass. The irregular surfaces trapped it, letting it accumulate in dense layers that stayed hidden from every flyover and satellite scan. But chemistry wasn't the only accomplice. The Sound's geography amplified the problem. Its islands and narrow channels acted like funnels, nudging the submerged slick into confined corridors where the currents slowed just enough for the crude to settle in place. Naked Island became one of the first kill zones. Its sheltered coves behaved like natural strainers, pulling the oil inward, tucking it into cliff cracks, weaving it through boulder fields, and depositing it beneath the ice where even divers struggled to reach. Have you ever seen oil trapped in rocks up close? What did it look like? From a helicopter, everything looked normal. Dark water, calm surface, nothing dramatic. But on the shoreline, the truth waited. As teams finally made landfall, they found black residue folded deep between stones, long ropes of thickened crude tangled through kelp, and entire pockets where the waterline looked varnished in asphalt. One by one, the coves revealed what the sky had hidden, a spill that hadn't spread wide. It had spread deep. Prince William Sound wasn't just contaminated. It was engineered by winter, chemistry, and geography to hide the scale of the disaster, delaying the moment when the world would understand what actually happened that night. The first biologists who reached the islands weren't confused by what they saw. They were terrified by what they didn't hear. Prince William Sound is usually alive with sound. The deep exhale of orcas surfacing, the sharp crack of a tail slap ricocheting through the fjords. But that morning, the air felt padded, unnaturally muffled, as if the entire coastline had swallowed its own breath. They tried something simple. They played a recording of the resident AB pod taken just 2 weeks before. Tight family calls, rapid clicks, the familiar course researchers knew by heart. Nothing answered. No splashes. No breaches. Just the soft hiss of oil licking the rocks. When the survey boats finally moved into the narrow hunting channels, they found the reason for the silence. The thickest, wax-heavy crude had been funneled directly through the routes orcas used to chase seals. Members of the at-one transient pod surfaced through that toxic lane, blowing oily mist from their blowholes, their white eye patches stained amber. One was seen circling the same stretch of water for almost 8 hours, as if waiting for a pod mate who would never surface. Have you ever seen an animal act strangely just before something went wrong? What happened to those whales wasn't a decline. It was an erasure. The sound didn't just lose animals. It lost voices. 250,000 seabirds. Dead. 2,800 sea otters. Drowned in oil. 300 harbor seals. Gone. 250 bald eagles. Poisoned. 22 orcas. Vanished. 72 hours. And that was only the first 3 days. Remember that silence after the crash? Here's why it was fatal. At 12:12 a.m., investigators later found a deleted radio entry reporting a catastrophic grounding. But no spill volume estimate was formally logged until the first damage assessment around 12:30 a.m. And still, the federal response didn't mobilize for 6 hours. This wasn't confusion. It was paralysis, knowing something was terribly wrong, but frozen by command chain indecision. Those 6 lost hours meant no containment booms, no skimmers, no crews in position. By dawn, oil had already surged deep into coves and fractures that boats couldn't physically reach, locking in a disadvantage no cleanup strategy could reverse. So the strategy changed. Pressure washers, industrial, burning hot, tide pools boiled, juvenile fish popped in the surf, steam lifted in heavy clouds, drifting over crews coughing through oily mist. Runoff turned red with shredded algae, and rocks were left bone white, scraped to the base layer. And the scale was staggering. 11,000 workers total. 10,000 rotating simultaneously, shuttled by helicopter across 160 miles of remote coastline. Teams rotated every 20 minutes because the heat and mist were overwhelming. Most beaches had no road access. Everything was rushed. Everything was scorched. If you had to choose, clean 100 beaches poorly or 10 perfectly, what would you pick and why? Months later, the truth surfaced. They hadn't just blasted away the oil. They had destroyed the biological film itself. The microorganisms, larvae, and tiny invertebrates that form the invisible foundation of an entire coastline. Without that film, natural recovery stalls for decades. Worse, beneath those polished rocks, buried pockets of SOR, subsurface oil residue, remained. Every major storm churned it loose, re-oiling beaches that looked clean only because their living surfaces had been burned away. One biologist summarized it with a line that still stings. We sterilized beaches the oil never would have reached. The shocking part wasn't the grounding. It was how predictable it had been. 4 years before the spill, internal memos warned that tankers in Prince William Sound were sailing with reduced crews, exhausted officers, and outdated radar. Radar that had been broken on the Exxon Valdez for over a year. Crews called it the ghost screen. Management called it non-essential. And that missing radio transmission you heard about earlier? It didn't vanish into thin air. It vanished into a system built on paper logs, rotating night staff, and a culture where reporting a catastrophic breach before dawn meant triggering a chain of responsibility nobody wanted to own. Loop A's silence. Loop B's human error. Loop C's disappearing message. None of them were accidents. They were symptoms. Even the safeguards that should have stopped the ship weren't there. A second escort tug, mandated after past near misses, had been quietly phased out to save time. Traffic monitoring relied on a single controller watching multiple channels. And the containment equipment, staged nearby, was rusted, undersized, and in some cases literally frozen to warehouse floors when the call finally came in. By the time federal response teams reached Bligh Reef, the math wasn't on their side anymore. Tankers that size don't just leak. They exhale oil through structural pressure. Even a perfect system would have struggled. But this wasn't a perfect system. It was one that assumed nothing catastrophic could happen because nothing catastrophic had happened recently. And the Sound paid for that optimism. So here's the quiet truth. Disasters like this rarely start with an explosion. They start with shortcuts, so small they barely make noise. Next section. The one moment that finally forced the world to listen. For a while, the world thought Prince William Sound was healing. Beaches looked cleaner. Boats were working again. News crews moved on. But it was a lie told by the surface. Beneath the rocks, beneath whole shorelines that looked untouched, scientists found something that wasn't supposed to exist years after a spill. SOR, subsurface oil residue. Sticky, oxygen-starved pockets that behaved like the spill had happened yesterday. Push a glove into the sand, and black crude still rose up like a bruise. And that hidden oil did something no one predicted. It broke an entire fishery. Herring, once the backbone of the region's commercial fleet, collapsed in 1993 and never returned. Not a dip, a cliff. The kind of ecosystem crash that rewrites a coastline. Sea otters recovered slowly. Birds rebounded in patches. But herrings stayed gone, and every species that depended on them collapsed in slow motion. For the towns along the Sound, the aftershock wasn't biological. It was personal. Families who had fished the same waters for generations watched their boats rot on trailers. Cannery lights went dark. Mortgage defaults climbed. Divorce rates spiked. Many fishermen described the decade that followed as an economic extinction. Entire identities, built around tide cycles and herring runs, cracked apart. And while people were holding their lives together with duct tape, another blow hit. The punitive damages reversal. A jury had awarded $5 billion. Money meant to rebuild lives and communities. Years later, after endless appeals, the Supreme Court reduced it to about $507 million, barely a tenth of the original award. Some fishermen waited nearly 20 years for payments that didn't even cover what they had lost in a single season. One captain summed it up: the oil washed away. The justice never came. If you lived in a town where the water defined your identity, and that water suddenly died, what would you do? Stay and fight, or leave and start over? By the late 2000s, the sound looked beautiful again. The mountains didn't change. The water still shone. But the engine of the ecosystem, the herring, never came back. And the people who depended on them never fully recovered either. This leaves one final question, not about the spill, but about what we choose to forget. Some disasters end. This one never did. Because today, 36 years later, approximately 23,000 gallons remain buried under the quiet beaches of Prince William Sound. Not floating, not visible, just waiting in the cold, oxygen-starved pockets where oil ages slower than anyone predicted. Scientists call it lingering oil. Fishermen call it something else. The reminder: dip a shovel in the wrong tidal layer, and the sand still bleeds rainbow. The chemistry hasn't relaxed. PAHs and parts per billion still stun herring embryos, still deform salmon fry, still show up where no one expected life to struggle. That's why the spill feels less like an event and more like an inheritance. A wound that defies natural decay. And the people who live there, they'll tell you the strangest part isn't the persistence of the oil. It's the persistence of a knowledge of how fast everything can fail when a system built on precision collapses into assumption. Of how silence on a radio, a misturn in ice, and one underreported call can ripple for generations. Most disasters leave a mark. This one left a memory, one the shoreline still carries, molecule by molecule, every time the tide rolls in.